Hi, I'm Chad with Move for Guitar. This lesson is from our series, Music Theory for Guitar. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about the difference between scale patterns and positions. First off, download our free e-guide, Music Theory for Guitar. It contains everything that I'm talking about in this lesson, all the charts and diagrams, as well as much more, so it'll be really useful to you. And like I said, it's free, so there's no reason not to just go download that. But I am working on it right now as I'm filming this lesson, so it may not be available as you're watching this lesson. And if it's not available yet, it'll say coming soon. And if you'd like to get notified when it is available, you can sign up for our mailing list and we'll send you a notification for when it is available and let you download it. And also, if you're signed up for our mailing list, you'll receive all updated versions as well. But don't worry, you don't need the e-guide to follow along with this lesson because all the charts and diagrams will be on the screen. And also, we add at least one new lesson every day, so be sure to subscribe. This is part 11 in our series, Music Theory for Guitar. If you'd like to go back and start at the beginning, you can click the link on the screen. So in these last lessons, we've been talking about the major scale, and I showed you in one of the previous lessons how to break up the major scale into patterns so that you can visualize the major scale up and down the whole fretboard and memorize it and get it under your fingers. In this lesson, I want to pause for a moment and clarify the difference between a scale pattern and a scale position. Many people use those terms interchangeably, or they use the term position instead of pattern, and that can be really confusing, so I want to clarify the difference in this lesson. So in the lesson we talked about patterns. I showed you scale pattern 1 I started with, which is right here. This is in the key of F again, but we're not worried about what key we're in. This pattern would stay the same no matter what key you're in. It would just be on a different spot on the fretboard. And just to clarify, all scales have patterns. The patterns for different scales are different. They have different shapes just because the interval structures are different for different scales, but they still have patterns. So for example, there's a scale called the minor pentatonic scale that has 5 patterns. So pattern 1 would start on the first note of the scale, the root of the scale, just like a major scale pattern 1 starts on the root of the scale. It's the same concept, it's just the patterns for different scales look different because of the interval structures. But don't worry too much about that right now, we'll get into other scales later. I just wanted to make that really clear that major scales are not the only scales with patterns. All scales have patterns. All scales can be broken up into patterns. So this is major scale pattern 1 because it starts on the root of the scale, and like I showed in the lesson where I talked about patterns, I showed you 7 patterns to break the major scale up into, and the first one started on the root, the second one started on the major second, the third one started on the major third, and so on. And this pattern would stay the same no matter what key you're in, and what key you're in just means what note you're starting with. So right here, this is an F note that we're starting with our root, so this is in the key of F, so it's an F major scale. But if I move the root to here, this is a G note. It's the same pattern, but now we're playing a G major scale because the root notes are all G's, so it's in the key of G. Same thing, I could move this exact same pattern, same shape up to here. This is a C, so this is a C major scale using pattern 1, just because what's under my root notes are C's. So that's what a pattern is. It's a shape that can be moved, and those shapes stay the same no matter what key you're in or what your root note is. It's just wherever your root notes are, those are the name of the scale. And like I said, this is C major scale right here because what's under the root is a C, and this is scale pattern 1 in C major. But when you're talking about positions, this is actually position 8. And a position is referring to where you are on the fretboard. So this is position 8 because when you're playing this, your first finger would be landing on the 8th fret. So that's what the position refers to, where your first finger is landing in the frets. Or if we went back to G, this would be scale pattern 1 in the key of G, G major scale pattern 1, but it would actually be position 3 because your first finger would be landing in the 3rd fret. Or if we went back to F, F would actually be major scale pattern 1 in the first position, so position 1, just because your first finger is landing on the 1st fret when you play this scale. But if you were to play major scale pattern 3 in the key of F, which this is right here, this would be position 5 because your first finger is landing in the 5th fret when you play this pattern. Or if you look at one more, this is again in the key of F, pattern number 2. You'd actually be in 2 positions when you play this pattern. You would start in 3rd position because that's where your first finger would land. You'd have your first finger, your second or your 3rd finger, and your 4th finger when you started it. But then when you reached here, you would shift over and this would become your first finger now. So that's when you would land in pattern or in position 2. So that's why major scale pattern 2, when you're using this shape, lands in 2 positions. So that's what you need to understand, the difference between patterns and positions. A pattern is just a shape that's going to stay the same no matter what key you're in. It's just you're going to be in a different spot on the fretboard. A position actually refers to where you are on the fretboard. And like I said, it's where your first finger lands. Or there's one more position to also consider, and that's open position. And it's a little different than the others because with open position, your first finger doesn't necessarily land in the open position where the open strings are. But since you're using open strings, this is considered the open position because you're using open strings and that's where you're starting. So that's why it's called the open position. So just to make it really clear, patterns are shapes that you can move anywhere on the fretboard. So pattern 1 will always look the same, but moving it to a different spot on the fretboard is going to put you in a different key because your root has changed. The note that is your root has changed. Position refers to where you're actually playing on the fretboard, so it doesn't have anything to do with patterns. A position is going to be a different pattern for different keys. And also you will hear patterns called shapes as well. Those are the same thing. A pattern and a shape is just referring to the same thing. But a position, when someone uses position interchangeably with pattern, that's not really correct and it's confusing. Position refers to where you're playing on the fretboard. So I just wanted to point that out because you'll hear that used a lot and it's important to understand the difference and not get confused by it. But when I talk about patterns, I'm talking about an actual shape like I've been showing you. But if I talk about positions, I'm talking about where you are on the fretboard. Again, download the e-guide. It'll be a great reference for all of this stuff. And you can just move on to the next lesson. This is just something I wanted to point out so that you don't get confused if you ever hear people using the term position or if you ever hear me use it. And be sure to subscribe because we add at least one new lesson every day.